I thought it was just another normal morning. The kind you don't even think about. I woke up, checked my phone, replied to a couple of messages, and got ready for university like I always did. Nothing felt different. Nothing felt wrong. If anything, it was peaceful. Quiet. The kind of calm that makes you believe the day will go exactly as planned. That I remember looking at myself in the mirror before leaving. Fixing my hair. Adjusting my bag on my shoulder. I even smiled for a second, thinking about him. He had texted me the night before, reminding me not to skip breakfast again. That was just how he was. Caring in small ways. Always paying attention to things I ignored about myself. Being with him made life feel stable. Predictable in a good way. That we weren't perfect, but we were real. He trusted me, and I trusted him. At least, that's what I believed back then. That I stepped outside and started walking toward the main road where I usually caught my ride. The streets were quieter than usual, but I didn't think much of it. It was still early. A few people here and there, some shops half open, the usual sounds slowly waking up with the day. Everything felt normal enough for me not to question it. That I kept walking, scrolling through my phone for a bit, thinking about assignments, random things, and whether I'd see him later. My mind was everywhere except where I actually was. Maybe that's why I didn't notice them at first. Two boys standing ahead. At first, they didn't seem like anything unusual. Just people on the street. I didn't slow down. I didn't change direction. I just kept walking, expecting to pass by them like I would with anyone else, but something felt off. It wasn't obvious. Not at first. Just a small shift in the air. The kind of feeling you can't explain but your body reacts to before your mind catches up. I told myself I was overthinking. That nothing was wrong. That I was just being paranoid. That I wish I had listened to that feeling instead. As I got closer, one of them stepped slightly into my path. Not enough to block me completely, but enough to make me stop for a second. I looked up, confused more than anything else. Before I could even say anything, the other one moved closer too. That's when it hit me. This wasn't normal. My heart started beating faster, and I tried to step around them, pretending I wasn't scared. Pretending this was still something I could walk away from. But they didn't move. Instead, one of them said something I barely processed. My ears were ringing, my thoughts racing, trying to understand what was happening. I remember saying, "Let me go," more than once. My voice didn't even sound like mine. It was shaky, almost distant, like I was hearing someone else speak. I kept hoping someone would pass by, that someone would notice, that this would somehow stop before it got worse, but no one came. Everything after that felt like it happened too fast and too slow at the same time. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't react the way I should have. My body felt frozen, like it had stopped listening to me completely. Fear does that. It takes away your control, piece by piece, until you're just there, stuck in a moment you never chose. I won't describe everything. I don't even think I can. Not because I don't remember, but because remembering feels like going back there again. And I've tried so hard not to. What I do remember is the feeling. The helplessness. I thought staying silent would make it easier. I told myself if I didn't say it out loud, if I didn't give it words, then maybe it wouldn't feel real. Maybe it would fade on its own, like a bad dream you forget after a few days. But it didn't work like that. It stayed with me. In my thoughts, in my body, in the way I moved, the way I spoke, the way I avoided everything that reminded me of that morning. The first few days were the hardest. I couldn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind went back there. Not in clear images, but in feelings. That same fear, that same helplessness. I would wake up suddenly, my heart racing, my hands cold, like I was still stuck in that moment. And every morning, I had to pretend like nothing was wrong. I stopped going to university for a while. I made excuses. Headaches, tiredness, anything that sounded believable enough. I avoided the route, the people, the entire outside world. My room became the only place where I felt slightly safe, even though the thoughts followed me there too. He noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed the small things. The way I stopped replying quickly. The way my tone changed. The way I avoided calls. At first, he thought I was just busy or stressed. He kept texting, checking on me, asking simple questions like, "Are you okay?" and "Did something happen?" Every time I read those messages, I felt something tighten inside me that I wanted to tell him. I really did. There were moments when I almost typed everything out. I would open the chat, stare at the screen, and imagine how the conversation would go. I imagined him being supportive, understanding, holding me through it even if it was just through words. But then another thought would take over. What if he didn't? What if he looked at me differently after that? What if he saw me as someone damaged, someone weak, someone who let it happen? I knew it wasn't my fault, at least logically I did, but that didn't stop the doubt. That didn't stop the fear of being judged by the one person whose opinion mattered the most to me. So I kept lying. "I'm just tired. I have a lot going on. I just need some time." At first, he accepted it. He told me to rest, to take care of myself, to call him whenever I felt better. But as days passed, my distance didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. I stopped sharing things with him. Conversations became shorter. I avoided anything emotional because I knew I wouldn't be able to hold it together if I started. He began to feel it too. The tone of his messages changed. They weren't just concerned anymore. They had confusion in them. Then frustration. He started asking more direct questions. "Why are you acting like this? Did I do something wrong? Why won't you just tell me what's going on?" And every time he asked, I felt worse, because it wasn't him. He hadn't done anything wrong. But my silence was slowly making it look like he had. I could see it happening, and still, I couldn't stop it. It was like I was trapped between two fears, the fear of telling the truth and the fear of losing him because I didn't. One night, he called me again. I almost didn't pick up, but something in me gave in. Maybe I missed him. Maybe I was just tired of running from everything. As soon as I heard his voice, I felt that familiar comfort, but it didn't last long. He asked me directly this time. No hesitation. "Are you hiding something from me?" There was a long pause. I could feel my throat tightening, my mind racing, my heart beating faster than it should. This was the moment. The moment where I could finally tell him everything. The moment where I could stop carrying this alone, but I didn't. I said no. The silence on the other end felt heavier than anything he could have said. I could tell he didn't believe me. He didn't argue immediately, but his voice changed. It lost that softness it always had. "You're not the same anymore," he said quietly. "And you won't even tell me why." I didn't have an answer for that. After that call, things got worse between us. He stopped texting as much. When he did, it felt different. Shorter. Distant. Like he was pulling back the same way I had been. And that scared me in a completely different way. For the first time, I felt like I was losing him, not because of what happened that day, but because of everything I did after it. The loneliness started to feel unbearable. I had no one to talk to. No one who knew what I was going through. I couldn't open up to him, and I couldn't keep everything inside without it breaking me slowly. That's when I started talking to someone else. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something I was looking for. It just happened. A simple conversation that turned into something more regular. At first, it was nothing serious. Just random talks to distract myself, to escape my own thoughts for a while, but then I realized something. It felt easier to talk to someone who didn't know me completely. Someone who didn't expect anything from me. Someone who wasn't asking the questions I was afraid to answer. I didn't have to pretend with them, but I also didn't have to reveal everything. It was a strange kind of comfort, and for the first time since that day, I felt like I could breathe a little. I knew it wasn't right. I knew I was crossing a line, even if it didn't feel like it at first. But I didn't stop. Because that small sense of relief, that distraction, that feeling of being understood without pressure, it was something I couldn't find anywhere else, not even with him anymore. And that's when I realized something had already started to change, something I didn't fully understand yet, but deep down, I knew this wasn't going to end well. At first, I told myself it wasn't wrong. I kept repeating that in my head like it would make it true. I said I just needed someone to talk to. Someone who didn't ask too many questions. Someone who didn't make me feel like I was hiding something every time I stayed quiet. And that's exactly what he was, that he didn't know me the way my boyfriend did. He didn't expect me to explain every mood, every silence, every change. Conversations with him felt light at the beginning. Simple. No pressure. No emotional weight attached to every word. I didn't feel like I was being watched or slowly figured out, and that made it dangerous, because slowly, without realizing it, I started looking forward to those conversations. I started checking my phone more often, waiting for his messages. It wasn't something I planned. It just happened. In the middle of all the chaos inside me, that small distraction felt like relief. He listened. Not in a deep, meaningful way at first, but enough to make me feel heard. And when I did open up, even a little, he didn't interrupt. He didn't question me in a way that made me uncomfortable. He just stayed there, responding in a way that felt easy to accept, that was enough for me to keep going. Meanwhile, everything with my boyfriend kept getting worse. The distance between us wasn't just emotional anymore. It became obvious. We barely talked like we used to. When we did, it felt forced. Like two people trying to hold on to something that was already slipping away. That he noticed everything, the delayed replies. The way I avoided calls. The way my attention wasn't fully there even when we spoke. I could feel his frustration building, even through simple messages. He didn't say it directly at first, but it was there. In his tone. In the way he stopped asking, "Are you okay?" and started asking, "What are you hiding?" And I still didn't tell him. Instead, I kept going back to the one place where I didn't feel questioned. Where I didn't feel like I was failing someone. That other conversation slowly became a habit. A routine. Something I depended on more than I wanted to admit. That it wasn't physical. Not even close. But it crossed a line long before I realized it, because I started sharing parts of myself there that I refused to share with the person who actually mattered. That I knew it was wrong. Every time I picked up my phone, there was this brief moment of hesitation. A small voice reminding me that this wasn't fair. That I was slowly becoming the kind of person I never thought I'd be. But that voice wasn't strong enough to stop me, not when everything else inside me felt heavier. The guilt started building quietly. Not all at once, but in small pieces. Every ignored call from my boyfriend. Every short reply. Every lie I told to avoid explaining where my attention really was. It all added up, even if I pretended it didn't, and then one day, everything caught up with me. That he didn't shout at first. He didn't accuse me right away. But I could tell something was different the moment he spoke. His voice had that controlled calm, the kind that comes when someone already knows something they wish they didn't. He asked me a simple question: "Who is he?" My mind went blank. That I didn't even ask what he meant. I knew exactly what he was talking about. There was no confusion, no misunderstanding. Just a sudden wave of panic hitting me all at once. That I tried to deny it. Of course I did. That I said it wasn't like that. That it was nothing serious. That I was just talking to someone. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew how weak they sounded. I knew there was no way to make it seem harmless anymore. That he had seen enough. Maybe it was messages. Maybe it was the way I changed. I never asked how he found out, because in that moment, it didn't matter. The damage was already done. His silence after my excuses felt worse than anger. Then he said it: "You're cheating on me." Hearing those words out loud felt like something breaking inside me. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain. I wanted to say it wasn't that simple. But the truth was, it didn't matter how I explained it. From his perspective, it was exactly what it looked like, and I had no real defense. The argument that followed wasn't loud in the way I expected. It was worse. It was controlled, tense, filled with everything we hadn't said to each other for weeks. He asked why. Over and over again. Not aggressively, but desperately. Like he was trying to find a reason that would make sense of it, and I couldn't give him one. Because the real reason. I hadn't told him why. At some point, I stopped trying to defend myself. The guilt, the pressure, the exhaustion of holding everything in, it all collapsed at once. And before I could stop myself, I said it, everything, not perfectly. Not in a calm, structured way. It came out broken, rushed, filled with pauses and moments where I could barely get the words out. But it was the truth. The whole truth I had been avoiding since that day. There was a long silence after I finished, longer than any silence we had shared before that I waited for him to say something. Anything. Comfort. Anger. Questions. I didn't know what I expected anymore. But the reaction I got wasn't what I imagined, that he didn't immediately comfort me, that he didn't immediately understand either, that I could hear the conflict in his silence. The way he was trying to process two completely different things at once. What happened to me, and what I did after, when he finally spoke, his voice was different. Not just hurt. Not just angry. Confused. Why didn't you tell me? That question hit harder than anything else, because I didn't have a good answer. That I said I was scared. That I didn't know how he would react. That I didn't want things to change between us. But even as I said it, I realized something painful. Things had changed anyway, and maybe my silence made it worse than it ever needed to be. That he didn't yell after that. He didn't accuse me again. But the distance in his voice was clearer than ever before. That in that moment, I understood something I had been avoiding. Telling the truth didn't fix anything. That it just exposed everything at once. After that conversation, I told myself it meant nothing. It was just a friendly exchange between two people who happened to cross paths. I had lived long enough to know how easily the mind can turn simple kindness into something more complicated. So I made a quiet promise to myself not to read too much into it, but the truth was that something had already shifted inside me. The next time I saw him, he greeted me with the same easy smile. It wasn't forced or overly familiar. It felt natural, as if continuing a conversation we had simply paused the day before. We spoke briefly at first, the way acquaintances do. A few polite questions, a few simple answers. Yet even those short exchanges carried a strange warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. Days passed, and our conversations slowly became longer. It never seemed planned. We would start with something ordinary, a small observation about the day, a casual comment about work or life. But somehow those conversations kept stretching further than expected. He had a way of asking questions that invited real answers rather than polite ones. That he asked about the places I had lived, the kind of work I used to do, the things I enjoyed before life became so routine. At first I responded carefully, giving short explanations without too much detail. But he listened in a way that made it easy to continue speaking. That I realized something strange after a while. No one had asked me these kinds of questions in years. Most of the people around me already assumed they knew my life story. Conversations with them rarely moved beyond familiar subjects. But with him, every topic seemed fresh. Even then I reminded myself how unusual the situation was. He was 27 years old, nearly 3 decades younger than me. The difference between our ages was impossible to ignore. If anything, that fact should have made our conversations awkward or uncomfortable. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The age gap seemed to remove certain expectations. He didn't treat me like someone fragile or outdated. He spoke to me as if my experiences were valuable, as if the years I had lived actually meant something. Still, I kept my distance emotionally. At least that's what I tried to do. One evening our conversation drifted into more personal territory. It happened gradually, without any clear moment where the subject changed. We were discussing life in general, the strange ways people grow older and realize their expectations didn't always match reality. That he asked if I was happy. The question caught me off guard because it was so simple. People rarely ask something that direct unless they already expect a complicated answer. For a moment I considered giving the usual response. The polite one people offer when they don't want to explain their real feelings. But something about the way he asked made that answer feel dishonest. So I hesitated before speaking. That I told him that life had been good in many ways. I had a long marriage, children who had grown into independent adults, and a life that most people would consider stable. Everything sounded respectable when described out loud, but then I admitted something I rarely said to anyone: sometimes stability feels a lot like loneliness. The words left my mouth before I could stop them. I immediately felt embarrassed, as if I had revealed something too personal to someone who barely knew me. I expected the conversation to become uncomfortable after that. Instead, he simply listened. That he didn't interrupt or rush to offer advice. He just allowed the silence to exist for a moment before responding quietly. "You deserve to be seen," he said. Those 4 words lingered between us. They weren't dramatic or exaggerated. Yet they carried a kind of sincerity that made them difficult to dismiss. That night I thought about that sentence more than I wanted to admit. It replayed in my mind while I washed dishes, while I prepared for bed, while I lay awake in the quiet darkness next to my husband. The strange part wasn't that a younger man had said something kind. The strange part was how deeply those words affected me. Over the following weeks our interactions continued. I noticed myself looking forward to those moments more than I should have. They broke the predictable rhythm of my days. Conversations with him felt lighter, more alive, as if a door inside me had quietly opened again. Without realizing it, I began paying more attention to small things about myself. I chose clothes more carefully when leaving the house. I brushed my hair with a little more patience. These were small changes, almost embarrassing ones, but they made me aware of how long it had been since I felt noticed. At the same time, guilt began whispering in the background of my thoughts. Nothing inappropriate had happened between us. Our conversations were still just conversations. Yet part of me knew that emotional lines can blur long before physical ones appear. One afternoon we found ourselves talking again longer than expected. The subject didn't matter much anymore. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from one topic to another with surprising ease. As we prepared to leave, he hesitated for a moment. The pause was subtle but noticeable. Then he spoke with a quiet honesty that made the air between us feel heavier. "I know this might sound strange," he said slowly, "but I really enjoy talking to you." His voice didn't carry the playful tone of casual flirting. It sounded sincere, almost cautious, as if he understood that the words might carry more meaning than they appeared to. For a second I didn't know how to respond. My instincts told me to laugh it off, to turn the moment into something harmless. But another part of me felt unexpectedly touched by the confession. I simply smiled and thanked him. The conversation ended shortly after that, but the feeling it left behind followed me home. When I walked through the door that evening, my husband was sitting in his usual spot watching television. The glow of the screen reflected across the room while the familiar silence settled around us. He barely looked up when I entered. I stood there for a moment, observing the scene that had once felt so normal. The quiet house, the routine, the comfortable distance that had defined our lives for years, and for the first time a dangerous question formed in my mind. What if the attention I had just experienced wasn't something temporary? What if someone else could offer the connection I thought had disappeared from my life forever? That thought alone was enough to make my heart beat faster, and it scared me more than anything else.